What's up, class? So today we're going to be covering some Islam. All right. So you should have the Islam notes pulled up, so you can fill in the blanks as you go along with the PowerPoint. Okay. So our objective today will be that you are able to identify key teachings of Islam. So the last of our five major world religions. Okay. One that is, I would say, pretty popular. Um, in the world, okay, for a different amount of reasons. It's one of the fastest growing religions in the world. So here's an Islamic mosque, okay, probably in the Middle East somewhere. Couldn't tell you exactly where. I know there is one mosque in Rockford. There are none in Freeport. You get to some bigger cities, there's probably more mosques. So Islam, the five major world religion, okay. So like Judaism and Christianity, it traces its roots back to Abraham. It has a clear founder, Muhammad, who lived from 570 to 632 AD. He lived in what is today Saudi Arabia. He is considered not a god or a god man, but the last and greatest prophet of God, a god Muslims refer to as Allah. Okay, so Muslims believe that Jesus was a person. They believe Moses was a person. They believe that they were all prophets. Okay. However, where it differs, Muslims believe that Muhammad received the last message from God. So what God told Muhammad was the way that good Muslims were supposed to act. Okay. When we talk about God, okay, they call him Allah. We call him God. The Jews call him Yahweh. Okay. It's all the same being. All right. It's not some different God. They all believe in the same one. Okay. However, Muhammad is their founder. Okay. And the last prophet. So Islamic teaching does not encourage depictions of Muhammad. Hence, there are very few pictures or depictions of him. All right. Saudi Arabia at the time of Muhammad was a land of a bunch of different tribes. Okay. Large group of people. If you know anything about geography, you know that Saudi Arabia is literally just a desert. Okay. This is all sand and oil. Some key facts about Muhammad. All right. He was orphaned very early in his life, spent the first 40 years of his life in Mecca. Mecca is considered the holiest city of Islam. He eventually became a merchant, okay, which a merchant's really just a businessman, all right, sells goods. Mecca was the site of a major temple of worship of the gods that were prevalent in the region at the time, okay. At the age of 40, he began his religious teaching, okay. So if you look back at Jesus, he begins teaching at age 30, okay. Muhammad's going to be a little bit older. So the major beliefs of Islam, okay, they believe that the Quran is the holy writings of Islam, all right, and the Quran is supposed to only be written in Arabic. Okay, I'm not sure if you can get translated versions of it or not, but that's what Muslims believe. They refer to their God as Allah, and it is a monotheistic faith. Muhammad is viewed as the last prophet of Allah, and the Quran is the final revelation of Allah. Muhammad taught this monotheistic faith in a polytheistic culture. Okay, the Kaaba, all right, one of the holiest sites in Muslims. You can see if you look closely, these are people. All right, this is a large structure. All right. For the second activity, you're going to watch inside Mecca. The main thing that Muslims do, okay, when they're in Mecca, is they come and see the Kaaba. All right. This is a woven, essentially carpet or rug. All right. A new one is made every year, and we're talking it's huge. Okay. Like you can see this guy down here. He's standing about 2 bricks. All right. It's another picture of the Kaaba. So Islamic tradition says that it was built by Abraham. Eventually, it became the center of polytheistic worship. Muhammad returned it to the worship of one God, Allah. It is the holiest site in Islam, and when Muslims are required to face it, okay, or Mecca, and pray 5 times a day. All right, when they're facing Mecca, they're facing the Kaaba. That is one of the five key teachings of Islam. So the five pillars, similar to what you would consider the Ten Commandments, okay, in Christianity, okay. Their five pillars say there is no God but Allah, okay. Pray 5 times a day, give to the poor, fast during the holiest month of Ramadan, okay. So Ramadan and the Arabic calendar is different from our calendar. So Ramadan changes, okay. It doesn't happen the same time every year. And when they fast, okay, they don't get to eat sun up to sundown. Make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your life, which is what the Inside Mecca video will be about. Okay. The 5 pillars help Muslims focus on Allah, learning, and helping the poor. So, some key Muslim practices. Okay. Religious holidays commemorate major events in the life of Muhammad, very similar to Christianity and Christmas and Easter. Okay. Ramadan requires fasting and reminds Muslims of Muhammad's fleeing to Medina. In the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, the date is different every year. So during the Hajj, it is a journey that has many requirements. There are also many steps while in Mecca, and these steps or activities are all part of the Hajj. Almost 1.5 million people a year visit the Hajj. All right, so the video you're going to watch is going to kind of go through this more step by step, so I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time going over these things. But essentially, they enter here, then to here, then to here, okay? Then they're going to walk all the way around, okay, all the way to another city of Arafat, all right, and then back. Here's just some photographs of the Hajj happening. So this is an area, all right, it's called the Tents of Mina, but these are put up every year for people to stay in. So as you can see here, the plains of Arafat, Muslims walking, all right, this is a desert, all right, it's hot. It is hard to do this. Okay, they throw stones at this wall, which is supposed to signify the devil. Some more. So the spread of Islam, all right, I believe this is the last part of your notes. Muhammad challenged the polytheistic beliefs in Mecca and was ejected by the authorities. He fled Mecca and began teaching elsewhere and established a following in Medina. From there, the movement grew, and eventually he returned to Mecca in 629, just a couple years before his death. By the time of his death, Islam had become a dominant force in the region. All right, Muhammad, different from Jesus, okay, lived for a pretty long time. All right, and one thing that Muhammad was good at, he basically gathered together an army of people, okay, and literally an army, and eventually came back to Mecca and said, "This is our religion and our faith, and we will be the dominant force in the area." Okay, so Muhammad and Islam initially was a little more aggressive than what Christianity was. After his death, the movement continued to spread. Okay, so this becomes the Islamic area of the world. All right, all of the Middle East. It even goes up into Spain. All right, if you go into Spain today, a lot of the structures will look similar to what Islamic structures are. Okay, in the Middle East, the Muslims in Spain are called the Moors. Okay, and it has a very strong following in the country of Spain. So two major strands emerge. Okay, I don't know if this is in your notes or not, but if it is, just keep going. All right. Sunni Muslims and the Shia Muslims. These divisions were based on who should lead the movement. So after Muhammad dies, okay, one side believes that a relative of Muhammad should be the leader. The other side believed that a relative or basically just the holiest man should be elected to be the leader. Okay, these divisions still exist today. All right, in the Middle East, there is turmoil constantly. Okay, a lot of that turmoil is between the Jews in Israel and Muslims in other country, but there's also areas like Iran who does not get along with places like Syria and Turkey and things like that. And a lot of that has to do with this divide and being Sunni and Shia. All right. So if you look at the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, 85% of them are Sunni. All right. 15% of them are Shia. We'll watch this video real quick. All right.
If we want to understand the Middle East, if we want to understand why conflicts are happening the way they are and how these conflicts may be resolved, we cannot take our eyes off of the Shia-Sunni conflict. Whether it's the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or the Syria war, or the escalating civil war in Iraq, they all involve sectarianism between Shias and Sunnis.
The Shia-Sunni divide is a political and religious divide around who was the rightful heir after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad in early Islam. Yes, it's remote history going back to the 7th century, but for millions of Muslims around the world, it's what defines them, sectarianism.
لأن الجريمة التي ارتكبت بحق الحسين لن تنتهي وإنما لا زالت فصولها التي نعيشها اليوم من الإرهابيين والطائفيين والحاقدين على الإسلام وأهل البيت.
Now, it is not as if you could say, well, let's just resolve this original dispute over the succession and we can be one. There is now 1400 years of different political, social, cultural, and theological history that separates them.
Of the approximately 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, about 85% are Sunni and 15% are Shia. This is a conflict of identity, far more than it is a conflict of belief and practice. People actually do feel this divide deeply, emotionally. We are seeing a catastrophic civil war in Syria between the Sunni and the Shia, an ongoing conflict in Lebanon between the majority Shia population and the Sunni leadership, and in Iraq over the last decade, a devastating battle between the Sunni minority and the Shia majority. We've seen it in Iran with a small Sunni population in the south, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, in which puritanical movements within Sunni Islam have slaughtered thousands of Shia. In Bahrain, the very large oppressed Shia majority has risen up against the Sunni leadership of that country.
This conflict stares America in the face. It does have an effect on US foreign policy and US interests in the region. Whether it's in Syria, where we've seen tens of thousands of people being killed and millions displaced, or Pakistan, where the US is concerned about what happens when it withdraws from Afghanistan, or Bahrain, where the US Fifth Fleet is based, Saudi Arabia, which is home to oil reserves, whether it's in Iraq, where the US has lost lives and billions of dollars in treasure.
There are dangers of fierce sectarian fighting if, for example, the terrorist organizations try to overrun sacred Shia sites, which could trigger Shia-Sunni conflicts that could be very hard to stamp out. So we have enormous interest there.
My greatest fear is that something could conflate that leads to an all-out sectarian regional war. God forbid that it should happen, but the ingredients for that happening are very much alive.
For most of Islamic history, Shiites and Sunnis have lived quietly side by side, not necessarily happily, but quietly. Pogroms and outright conflict have been rare in history, and they happen when there is a political prize to fight over. The most important primary event that brought the Shia-Sunni conflict into the fore was the Iranian Revolution. Once the Shiites asserted their preeminence in carrying out an Islamic revolution in Islamic politics, there was immediately Sunni backlash.
Fast forward to 2003, when Saddam Hussein fell for the first time in that capital, you have a Shiite-dominated government, which didn't go unnoticed in the Gulf, and certainly not in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh. And as chaos spread through Iraq, you could only depend on your own community and your affiliation with that community to keep you alive. And that's when you really saw the Sunni-Shia divide become personal. It was no longer political, but it was neighborhood to neighborhood and neighbor to neighbor.
The Arab uprisings have also been a factor that's reignited the conflict. This is why you see a civil war in Syria that has a strong sectarian dimension. In many countries, what started as a political rivalry evolved into also a religious conflict.
It's not that the Shias and Sunnis were not there in history before. It was that sectarianism was contained by the structure of authoritarian regimes in the Arab world. The structure that was containing them cracked. So that actually caused the fight that was simmering below this edifice of calming the region to erupt.
أدعو المسلمين أن يذهبوا لينصروا إخوتهم في سوريا. لا يمكن أن ندع إخوتنا يقتلون ونحن نتفرج، حرام علينا. وإذا احتاجت المعركة مع هؤلاء الإرهابيين التكفيريين أن أذهب أنا وكل حزب الله إلى سوريا، سنذهب إلى سوريا.
Whether it's Shia or Sunni, the motivation is all the same. What they all have in common is the embrace of theological justifications to legitimize the violence that they perpetrate, that transforms the motivations to commit this violence to something much more personal. For all these groups to survive and for all of them to engage in terrorism, they need some outside patron, whether it's wealthy individuals or whether it's a state backer.
Both Iran and Saudi Arabia have been responsible for escalating this Sunni-Shia divide, and they are doing it for their own geopolitical interests. It's not just a perception that these two countries are trying to control different parts of the Middle East. It's reality. It's in the form of funding, it's in the form of arms, it's in the form, in some cases, of even soldiers inside these countries.
There are no bright spots in the region. Sectarianism will mean instability in the region for some period. It'd be difficult for states to rule over their populations happily. You're going to end up with challenges to authorities, civil wars, violence, bombings, etc. That would keep the region from focusing on economic growth, focusing on political stability. What we can do is to encourage the major regional powers to deal with their differences. And we have to help Middle East states cross this transition from authoritarianism to veritable democracy.
You can't say to a minority, whether it be a Sunni or a Shiite, democracy will be great for you because what people hear is majority rules. That's not democracy. And until there's a system that protects different sectarian expressions of religion, there's not an answer in the region to the Sunni-Shia divide.
All right, so these are just the Sunni-Shia divide, all right, in other countries. Okay. So taking a look here, a little bit more of the spread of Islam. All right, so from 750 to 1258, Islam spread throughout the Middle East and into Europe. It's known as the Islamic Golden Age. The Muslim empire was large, very well developed, and developed a very advanced culture. This golden age was ended by the Mongols, who conquered the region in 1258. The Mongol Empire did not last long, and eventually Muslims were able to overthrow them, but never quite regained their golden age. So today, about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, okay, the second largest world religion behind Christianity, fastest growing religion, all right, and approximately 2.6 million Muslims in the U.S. All right, so just a little map here, okay, and then that is all that we have. So hopefully you filled those notes out and you're good to go.